Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. My name is Brandon, and this is how a simple prenup conversation exposed my fiancée's true intentions and saved me from a marriage built on financial opportunism rather than love. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent the last 12 years building something I'm genuinely proud of. After graduating with a computer science degree, I worked for a few tech companies before starting my own software consulting firm. But gradually the business grew. Beyond the company, I've been investing. I own a diversified stock portfolio and recently purchased some land and was waiting for the city's permit to build a 4-bedroom house, where my fiancée and I plan to live after our wedding. By most measures, I was within the lines of achieving the American dream through hard work and smart decisions. I met Josephine 3 years ago at a networking event for young professionals. She was working for a mid-sized advertising agency, and we struck up a conversation about some random thing that kept us talking for a long while. Josephine was beautiful, articulate, and seemed like a genuinely interesting person. By the end of the event, I knew I wanted to meet with her again, so I exchanged contact details with her. We continued our conversation online when I left some messages for her that night. Our early dates felt natural and balanced. Josephine had her own career, her own apartment, her own social circle. She came from a comfortable middle-class family. Her father was a high school principal, her mother worked as a nurse. So she wasn't struggling financially, but also wasn't wealthy. She seemed to appreciate that I was ambitious and successful, without being ostentatious about it. It didn't take a soothsayer to tell me by our third date that I was in love with this woman. By the third month, I mustered the courage to tell her how I felt. I was relieved and happy when she said that the feeling is mutual. The first year of our relationship was everything I'd hoped to find with someone. Josephine was supportive of my business, understanding when I had to work late or travel for client meetings. She had her own goals and interests, which made our time together feel chosen rather than desperate. We traveled together, attended each other's work functions, and gradually integrated our social circles. By year 2, we were spending most weekends together and talking seriously about the future. She seemed to want the things I want, and it felt like we were meant for each other. But during this period of talking about marriage, I noticed Josephine's interest in my financial situation increased. I was doing well business-wise, but I do not discuss all the details with her. She'd ask detailed questions about my business revenue, how much it would likely generate, and whether I had retirement savings. At the time, I interpreted this as healthy curiosity about the practical aspects of building a life together. Now I realized she was conducting due diligence on my net worth and if it was enough to run a family. Josephine also began making comments about lifestyle expectations that I never attached deep meaning to. She'd mentioned friends who'd married up and were now living in nice neighborhoods, driving luxury cars, taking expensive vacations. She'd talk about how marriage meant sharing everything, how couples should be partners in all aspects of life, including financial. All these sounded nice to me then because I intend to be a traditional man and provide for my family. Back then, I thought she was talking about emotional and intellectual compatibility. Now I understand she was talking about asset accumulation. Around 3 years after we'd started dating, I proposed to Josephine during a weekend trip. I'd been planning this proposal for months, working with a jeweler to design a unique ring, coordinating with the resort to arrange a private dinner overlooking the vineyards. Josephine's reaction was everything I'd hoped for: tears of joy, immediate yes, excitement about calling our families. The engagement period felt like the natural culmination of everything we'd been building together. We set a wedding date, made a decision to book a venue at a vineyard, and started planning what we both described as the celebration of our commitment to building a life together. In the weeks that followed, Josephine threw herself into wedding planning with impressive organization and attention to detail. She researched photographers, coordinated with caterers, designed invitations, and managed the dozens of decisions required for a formal wedding. She seemed genuinely excited about the marriage itself, not just the party, talking about our future home, potential travel plans, and even names for future children. It was during this planning period that I purchased the land where we planned to build a 4-bedroom house after the wedding. It was going to be a significant upgrade from both of our current living situations. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a large kitchen Josephine had specifically requested, and a home office where I could work while I was home. The venue for the wedding was finally booked as we finalized on the wedding date. Invitations were ordered and addressed. Josephine's dress was purchased and fitted. We were 3 months away from what I expected to be the beginning of our married life together. Everything seemed to be progressing exactly as planned. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Friday evening. Josephine had come over for the weekend, and we'd just finished dinner on my patio, enjoying a bottle of wine and discussing final wedding details. The mood was relaxed and intimate, and I thought it was the perfect time to bring up a practical matter I'd been considering. I mentioned that my lawyer had recommended we consider a prenuptial agreement, framing it as protection for both of us. I explained that since I owned a business and investment properties, a prenup would clarify how assets would be handled if anything ever happened to our marriage. I emphasized that it was standard practice for people with significant assets, nothing personal about our relationship specifically. Josephine's reaction was immediate and intense. Her entire demeanor changed from relaxed and affectionate to defensive and angry. She asked why I was even thinking about divorce before we were married, whether I was having second thoughts about our relationship, and if I was planning to leave her after we got married. When I tried to explain that prenups were simply good financial planning, like having insurance or writing a will, Josephine became more emotional. She said that asking for a prenup proved I didn't trust her, that real love meant being willing to share everything without legal protection. She accused me of treating our marriage like a business transaction rather than a romantic commitment. The phrase that stopped me cold was when Josephine said, "I'm not signing a prenup. You should trust me." She made it sound like my request was evidence of a character deficiency rather than basic financial prudence. I remained calm during this conversation, reassuring Josephine that I did trust her and that the prenup was about protecting us both, not about expecting our marriage to fail. But her defensiveness and the intensity of her reaction planted a seed of doubt that I couldn't ignore. The evening was effectively ruined. Josephine became withdrawn and cold, going to bed early without the affection that usually characterized our time together. I stayed up thinking about her reaction, trying to understand why someone who genuinely loved me would be so opposed to a legal arrangement that protected both of our interests. The more I replayed the conversation we had earlier that day, the more confused I was. She is intelligent enough to know how prenups work, but she's acting like it was a tool I intend to use against her. That night, I realized that Josephine's reaction didn't sound like someone who wanted to protect our love from legal complications. It sounded like someone who wanted to maintain access to my assets without legal restrictions. Someone who saw a prenup as an obstacle to her financial security rather than protection for our relationship. Over the weekend, Josephine remained distant and occasionally made passive-aggressive comments about trust and commitment. When she left Sunday evening, the tension between us was obvious. She said she needed time to think about whether she wanted to marry someone who didn't trust her enough to share everything unconditionally. The following Monday, I called my lawyer to discuss the situation. Beyond prenuptial agreements, he explained another option that some clients had used when they wanted to test a partner's motivations, temporarily transferring assets to family members' names. The strategy was straightforward. If Josephine was genuinely marrying me for love rather than financial security, then my net worth shouldn't matter to her decision. If she was motivated by access to my assets, then removing those assets would reveal her true priorities. My lawyer explained that I could legally transfer ownership of my business shares, investment properties, and savings accounts to my mother's name. The transfers would be legitimate and binding, but could be structured with terms that allowed me to reclaim ownership after a specified period. From a legal standpoint, I would temporarily own nothing of significant value. The more I thought about this approach, the more it seemed like the perfect test of Josephine's sincerity. If she truly loved me, regardless of my financial situation, then marrying someone who technically owned nothing shouldn't be a problem. If her opposition to the prenup was motivated by a desire for asset access, then this arrangement would expose that motivation clearly. I discussed the plan with my mother, who was surprisingly supportive. She said she'd observed enough relationships over her 62 years to know that money often brought out people's true character, and that it was better to discover Josephine's real priorities before marriage rather than during a divorce. Over the next 2 weeks, my lawyer prepared the paperwork for transferring all significant assets to my mother's legal ownership. The business shares, properties, investment accounts, even my savings, everything went into her name with documentation that established the temporary nature of the arrangement. The process was more complex than I'd expected, requiring notarized documents, title transfers, and coordination with my business accountant to ensure everything was legally airtight. But within 2 weeks, I technically owned almost nothing beyond my personal belongings and checking account. I called Josephine and told her I wanted to schedule a meeting where my lawyer could explain something important about our prenup discussion. I said I'd found a solution that might address her concerns about trust and asset protection. Josephine agreed to meet, probably expecting that I was going to withdraw the prenup request. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at my lawyer's office. Josephine arrived expecting to discuss wedding planning logistics or perhaps my decision to abandon the prenup idea. Instead, my lawyer presented her with documentation explaining that all my significant assets had been transferred to my mother's legal ownership. As Josephine read through the papers, I watched her face change from confusion to disbelief. She looked up from the documents and asked what this meant for our marriage, for the house we'd planned to live in, for our financial future together. I explained calmly that since she'd said a prenup was unnecessary if I trusted her, and since she didn't want legal protection of assets, I'd removed the assets from the equation entirely. Now, we could marry purely for love, without any financial considerations complicating our relationship. The silence in that room was deafening. Josephine stared at the paperwork, then at me, then back at the documents. My lawyer tried to explain that prenups actually protect both parties and that this arrangement was unusual, but Josephine wasn't listening to legal advice anymore. At first, Josephine laughed nervously, probably thinking this was an elaborate bluff designed to pressure her into signing a prenup. When she realized the asset transfers were genuine and legally binding, her questions revealed everything I needed to know about her priorities. She expressed concern about my mother's age and what would happen to the assets if something happened to her health. Every question Josephine asked focused on financial security, lifestyle maintenance, and asset access. Not once did she express happiness that we could now marry without legal complications. Not once did she say that my net worth didn't matter to her feelings. Not once did she suggest that this proved we could build a life together based purely on love. Instead, she became increasingly agitated as she realized that marrying me would no longer provide the financial advancement she'd been expecting. The woman who'd accused me of not trusting her was now panicking about the prospect of marrying someone who couldn't support the lifestyle she'd been planning. After about 20 minutes of questions that revealed her true motivations, I thanked Josephine for her honesty. I told her that this arrangement would allow us to marry for love only, without any financial considerations influencing our decision. I said I was excited that we could now build our relationship on the foundation she'd claimed to want, pure emotional commitment without material complications. Josephine sat frozen, probably realizing that her opposition to the prenup had trapped her in exactly the situation she'd been trying to avoid. She couldn't express disappointment about my reduced net worth without admitting that financial security had been motivating her marriage decision. She couldn't demand access to assets while claiming that money didn't matter to her. After several more minutes of uncomfortable silence, Josephine stood up and said she needed time to process this information. She left the lawyer's office without scheduling another meeting or discussing next steps for our relationship. Over the following week, Josephine's true priorities became undeniably clear. She stopped initiating contact, became distant during our conversations, and seemed to be reconsidering our entire relationship. When I'd suggest wedding planning activities or discuss our future together, she'd make excuses about needing more time to think. 2 weeks after the lawyer meeting, Josephine asked to meet for coffee. She came prepared with a speech about how my asset transfer had fundamentally changed our relationship dynamic. She said that marrying someone who owned nothing felt like too much financial risk, that she needed security and stability in a partnership. Josephine tried to frame her decision as being about trust and communication rather than money, but her reasoning was transparently focused on financial concerns. She said she couldn't marry someone who'd made such a drastic decision without consulting her, someone who'd prioritized his mother's interests over their shared future. The engagement was over. Josephine returned the ring and said she needed to focus on her own financial independence rather than building a life with someone whose assets were controlled by family members. She made it sound like a mature decision about compatibility rather than an admission that she'd been planning to marry me for money. Behind the scenes, mutual friends later told me that Josephine had been more direct about her reasoning. She'd admitted to several people that she couldn't marry a man who technically owned nothing, that she'd expected marriage to improve her financial situation, and that the asset transfer had eliminated the primary benefit she'd been seeking. I spent the following month canceling wedding arrangements, returning deposits, and notifying guests that the marriage was off. Josephine and I agreed to tell people that we'd realized we weren't compatible rather than explaining the financial test that had revealed her true motivations. The legal time frame for the asset transfer was 6 months, after which ownership would automatically revert to me unless renewed. 3 months after Josephine ended our engagement, my lawyer initiated the process of returning all properties, business shares, and investments to my name. By the time our original wedding date arrived in October, I owned everything I'd built again, but I was single and relieved rather than married and potentially being taken advantage of. The temporary asset transfer had cost me some legal fees and administrative hassle, but it had saved me from a lifetime with someone who valued my portfolio more than my person. Looking back, I realized that Josephine's reaction to the prenup conversation had been the real revelation. Someone who genuinely loved me would have been willing to sign a reasonable legal protection for both of us. Someone who saw marriage as an emotional commitment rather than a financial transaction would have understood that prenups protect relationships rather than threatening them. The asset transfer test had simply confirmed what Josephine's initial reaction had already revealed, that she was more interested in marrying my financial security than marrying me. Her inability to proceed with marriage when I temporarily owned nothing proved that her commitment had been conditional on asset access rather than genuine affection. Today, I'm grateful for the lawyer's creative solution and my mother's willingness to help protect my interests. The temporary inconvenience of not owning my assets was a small price to pay for discovering Josephine's true character before we were legally bound together. The prenup conversation will definitely happen earlier in future relationships, and I'll pay close attention to how it's received. Someone who truly loves you won't be threatened by legal protection for both parties. Someone who sees marriage as a partnership rather than a financial advancement opportunity will understand that prenups protect the relationship rather than undermining it. Josephine taught me that money really does reveal character. And sometimes the most expensive tests are the ones you don't take. The cost of discovering someone's true motivations before marriage is infinitely smaller than the cost of discovering them during a divorce. If you're in a relationship where discussions of financial protection are met with emotional manipulation, where your partner seems more interested in your assets than your character, where marriage is framed as unconditional sharing rather than mutual respect, pay attention to those red flags. Real love doesn't require you to make yourself financially vulnerable to prove your commitment. Real partnership includes respect for both people's interests and protection for both people's contributions. And real character reveals itself when the stakes are high and the choices matter. I dodged a bullet, and I'm grateful for the lesson. Sometimes the best marriages are the ones that never happen. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you would have done if you were in my shoes.